All right, ever wonder how the U.S. became like the big global power it is today? It's a pretty wild ride, going from a bunch of colonies to like a superpower, all in just a few centuries.
Right.
And today, we're going to dive deep into how that happened.
Okay.
Specifically, the rise of U.S. hegemony
Yeah.
and what that means for, global order and all that.
Yeah.
This is especially important stuff, by the way, if you're a UPSC aspirant.
Yeah.
Trying to wrap your head around international relations.
Well, absolutely. This comes up all the time in those IR papers. And for
Hey.
good reason. If you want to understand the world today, you got to understand U.S. hegemony.
Totally. So we got some excerpts here from a text on U.S. hegemony and global order. And honestly, I'm already hooked.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. One thing that really jumped out at me right away was how they compare the U.S. to all those historical empires. Like, how does the U.S. story differ from, say, the Roman Empire or the British Empire?
That's a great question, and it's a super important distinction to make. You see, people often call the U.S. an empire, but it didn't exactly follow the traditional empire-building playbook,
Yeah.
There's a couple of reasons for that. First, the U.S., well, it was born from a revolution against colonialism, so that anti-imperialist ideology, it's kind of baked right into its DNA.
So those core American values, individual liberty, limited government, they kind of clash with the whole idea of like ruling over other nations.
Exactly. That's the heart of it. And the second key difference is how the U.S. expanded. Think about it. The North American continent, it's huge.
Vast.
The U.S. could grow internally, absorbing new land and resources without needing to conquer overseas territories, unlike, well, the British, for example.
So it's internal expansion versus external expansion.
Exactly.
That's a fascinating contrast.
Yeah.
But even with this unique path, the 20th century still became known as the American century. What was it that really catapulted the U.S. to the global forefront?
Yeah. World War II, definitely a turning point. Europe was devastated, and you had the Soviet Union emerging as this major power. So the U.S. stepped in, filled the leadership vacuum in the West, both economically and militarily.
So the U.S. becoming a leader, it wasn't necessarily intentional, more of a response to the global situation.
Exactly. It's like they were thrust into the role, and they became the architect of all those institutions you study for UPSC, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank. They poured resources into rebuilding Europe with the Marshall Plan, and of course they became the leader of the free world, facing off against the Soviet Union in the Cold War.
That's a lot of responsibility. It makes sense that eventually some cracks would start to show in this whole global leadership role, right?
Right.
And our source mentions challenges to U.S. hegemony, like popping up in the 1970s. What were some of the key pressure points there?
Oh, there were a few. You had the Vietnam War, which was a huge military and political setback. Then there was Watergate, eroding trust in the government back home. Oh, and the Iran hostage crisis really showed that the U.S., well, they weren't always in control.
So kind of a mix of internal problems and external challenges all coming together.
Exactly. And this brings us to this concept of imperial overreach, which is, well, some argued that the U.S. had spread itself too thin globally, trying to, police the world, manage the global economy, and contain communism all at the same time.
Yeah, too much on their plate.
Right. And that's where history often offers a cautionary tale. Many great powers throughout history, they've risen to prominence, overextended themselves, and ultimately declined. So the big question was, would the U.S. be able to break that historical pattern?
And spoiler alert, looks like they did, at least for a while.
At least for a while, yeah. It's pretty amazing how the U.S. bounced back from all those challenges in the late 20th century. I mean, under Reagan, you had this resurgence of American nationalism, a renewed focus on military strength, then all these policies that fueled economic growth. Right. But the biggest game changer, hands down, it has to be the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right. Suddenly no rival superpower.
Exactly.
The U.S. is standing alone at the top, a unipolar world.
Yeah, that's what they called it.
That must have been, a pretty heady moment.
Oh, it was. But it also raised some big questions. Could the U.S. actually handle this unipolar moment responsibly? Would it be tempted to just act unilaterally without even thinking about international norms?
Right.
And then what new threats might pop up in this post-Cold War world?
Which brings us to 9/11.
Yeah.
A pivotal event.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it reshaped global politics completely.
Yeah.
And U.S. foreign policy right along with it.
for sure.
Hard to overstate the impact of that day.
Absolutely. And for those of you, prepping for UPSC,
Right.
the events after 9/11, super crucial to understand the world today. It's like it marked this shift away from the Cold War, that whole paradigm of ideological conflict, to something, I don't know, a bit murkier.
Right. It wasn't communism versus capitalism anymore. So how did experts try to make sense of this new era?
Well, one really influential theory, though definitely controversial,
Okay.
was Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
He basically argued that the fundamental source of conflict in this century, it wouldn't be ideological or economic, but cultural and religious.
Specifically, a clash between the West and Islam.
Yeah, that's a pretty provocative idea, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It had a huge impact on how people interpreted the war on terror.
Yes.
Some saw 9/11 as proof that this clash was already happening.
So not just, isolated acts of terrorism,
Right.
but like the beginning of a much larger civilizational conflict.
That was one way to look at it. But not everyone agreed with Huntington. Another framework that emerged was Robert Cooper's idea of a world divided into pre-modern, modern, and postmodern states.
Okay, break that down for me. What are the characteristics of each of these worlds?
Okay, so Cooper saw pre-modern states as basically characterized by chaos and instability. Think failed states, warlords, widespread poverty, places where the government has very little control.
Got it.
Modern states, on the other hand,
Yeah.
they still operate within that traditional system of power politics, vying for influence and resources.
Okay, makes sense. And postmodern states.
That's where Cooper puts the European Union and to some extent the U.S.
Indeed.
Interesting. These are states that have, in theory at least, moved beyond power politics and embraced things like multilateralism, international law, cooperation.
So it's like a hierarchy of progress.
Yeah.
With the postmodern world at the top.
You could see it that way, but Cooper's real point was that these different worlds are constantly interacting.
Right.
And the instability of the pre-modern world, it can spill over and threaten the modern and even the postmodern worlds.
And that's where the threat of terrorism and WMDs becomes even more dangerous.
Exactly. Imagine a failed state gets its hands on nuclear weapons. The stakes are, well, incredibly high.
That's a scary thought. So how did the U.S. respond to these new challenges in the aftermath of 9/11? Our source talks about this thing called the Bush Doctrine.
Right. So the Bush Doctrine, it was heavily influenced by neoconservative thinkers.
Okay.
And they believed that the U.S. had a moral obligation and the military might to spread democracy around the world, even if it meant using force.
So like a missionary zeal.
Yeah.
Combined with like a willingness to use hard power.
Yeah, you could put it that way. And this is the thinking that led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Which was highly controversial, to say the least.
Oh, absolutely. The Bush administration, they claimed that Saddam Hussein had WMDs and ties to al-Qaeda.
Right.
But a lot of people saw it as an act of aggression based on, I don't know, pretty flimsy evidence.
And regardless of the initial reasons, I mean, the war in Iraq, it turned into this long and bloody quagmire.
It did. The U.S. military might have toppled Saddam pretty quickly.
Right.
But they got bogged down in this counterinsurgency war. And that focus on Iraq, it diverted resources and attention away from Afghanistan, where the Taliban was, making a comeback.
It sounds like the war on terror was proving to be a lot more difficult than people had expected.
Oh, it was. The U.S. was facing some serious challenges. One was, I think, this over-reliance on military force. I mean, the U.S. has the most powerful military in the world, no question.
Right.
But it's not always the best tool for dealing with complex issues like terrorism and insurgency.
Right. Like trying to solve a diplomatic puzzle with a sledgehammer.
Exactly. And using that heavy-handed force, it can backfire. It breeds resentment and fuels anti-American sentiment.
Yeah, for sure. And the second challenge?
The second challenge was this idea of imposing democracy from above. The Bush administration, they seemed to believe that you could just, remove a dictator, hold elections, and poof, democracy would just magically appear.
But building a stable democracy, it's a much more complicated process, right? It requires strong institutions, a culture of democratic values, a vibrant civil society. It's not something you can just force overnight.
No. And the U.S. experience in Iraq and Afghanistan really demonstrated how difficult and how costly that process can be.
And then the third challenge?
The third challenge was the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right.
You see, the Bush administration's strong support for Israel, well, it alienated a lot of people in the Arab and Muslim world, and that made it harder to build alliances and partnerships in the region.
Yeah.
It fueled this perception of the U.S. as biased and meddling in a conflict that was already so sensitive.
So all of these challenges they led to growing doubts about the effectiveness of the Bush administration's approach to the war on terror.
Right.
Did they change course at all?
Well, during his second term, President Bush did start to shift towards a more multilateral approach.
Okay.
But the most significant changes came with the election of Barack Obama in 2008.
Okay, so Obama comes in, promising change.
Right.
How did that translate into U.S. foreign policy?
Well, Obama's approach was definitely characterized by a greater emphasis on diplomacy and engagement, especially with the Muslim world. He toned down the rhetoric of the war on terror, called for a new beginning in U.S.-Muslim relations, and made overtures to countries like Iran.
So a shift away from the hard power of the Bush years toward the more nuanced approach.
Exactly. This is what some people called smart power, recognizing that military strength, well, it's only one tool in the toolbox.
Right.
And sometimes the best way to achieve your goals is through cooperation and persuasion rather than coercion.
But even with this shift in approach, the U.S. was still pretty heavily involved militarily in Afghanistan and Iraq. Right.
Yeah, they were. In fact, Obama initially escalated the war in Afghanistan, sent in tens of thousands of additional troops as part of a surge strategy. But he also set a timetable for withdrawal, signaling that, the U.S. wasn't planning to stay there forever.
So a more nuanced approach, but still a significant military commitment.
Right.
What are we supposed to make of all this?
Right.
Was Obama's presidency a genuine break from the Bush years, or just a rebranding of U.S. power? And what does it all mean for the future of U.S. hegemony?
Those are the million-dollar questions, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
And ones that we will explore further in Part 3.
All right, UPSC gurus and fellow global citizens, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into U.S. hegemony and global order.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the U.S.'s unique rise to power to the challenges of that whole post-9/11 world.
Definitely.
So now, the big question.
Yeah.
What's next for the U.S.? Is its dominance, fading, or is it just changing shape?
That's the debate that's been going on for years.
Yep.
There's no easy answer.
Right.
Let's look at some facts.
Okay.
The U.S. still has the most powerful military on the planet. Its economy is massive.
Yeah.
Its cultural influence is everywhere you look.
Sure.
And it's leading the charge in tech innovation.
So from a purely power-based perspective, the U.S. seems pretty secure. But I'm guessing it's more complicated than that.
Right. Power isn't just about, tanks and dollars. It's also about influence, legitimacy, and the ability to shape global events.
Right.
And that's where things get a little more, nuanced.
Yeah.
Those long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they took a toll on America's image abroad.
Yeah, for sure.
It raised questions about their judgment,
Uh-huh.
And it strained some alliances.
And then there's the whole economic rise of China.
Oh, yeah.
And other emerging powers.
Right.
It's got to be shifting the balance of power, too.
Absolutely. We're moving towards a multipolar world with new centers of power challenging U.S. dominance. So the U.S. has to adjust its strategies,
Right.
Figure out its place in this more complex global system.
So let's talk strategies.
Okay.
We left off discussing Obama's smart power approach.
Yeah.
Was that a real shift or just, clever PR? And what happened after Obama?
Okay, so smart power. It was an attempt to move beyond that Bush era focus on military solutions, Recognize that hard power alone wasn't enough.
Right.
It was about using all of America's assets, diplomacy, economics, cultural influence to get things done.
Sounds good on paper.
Yeah.
But did it actually work?
It's kind of a mixed bag.
Okay.
The Obama administration, they scored some wins like the Iran nuclear deal, reopening ties with Cuba. But they also faced some major setbacks, too, like the rise of ISIS, the Syrian civil war, Russia kind of flexing its muscles in Crimea.
Yeah. So then came the Trump presidency. And that seemed like, a pretty dramatic departure from Obama.
To say the least.
To put it mildly.
Trump's America First agenda was basically all about skepticism towards global cooperation and those big international institutions.
Right.
He pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal,
Yeah.
slapped tariffs on China and other countries, starting trade wars.
This is a much more, I don't know, go-it-alone confrontational approach.
Exactly. Trump, he viewed the world as this zero-sum game. You know, if someone else wins, America loses.
Okay.
He wasn't afraid to use America's power to get what he wanted, even if it meant alienating allies along the way.
And now we've got the Biden administration
Right.
trying to, I don't know, clean up some of that mess and rebuild America's reputation globally.
Yeah, that's the stated goal.
Right.
They've rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement.
Okay.
They're trying to salvage the Iran nuclear deal, and they're putting a lot of emphasis on working with allies.
So back to a more cooperative multilateral approach.
I mean, in theory, yes,
Yeah.
but it's still early, you
Right.
know? Only time will tell how effective they'll be in reclaiming that leadership role and shaping events on the world stage.
Right.
The global landscape, it's changed a lot in recent years.
Yeah.
The U.S. is facing this whole new set of challenges, you know? A rising China, a resurgent Russia, climate change, pandemics, and all this rapid technological advancement.
So back to our original question.
Yeah.
Is U.S. hegemony fading or is it just transforming? It sounds like there's no easy answer.
There isn't. The U.S. is still a powerful force,
Yeah.
but it's facing unprecedented pressure from all sides.
Right.
Its future and the future of global order really hinges on its ability to adapt to these challenges, you know, and find its footing in a world that's becoming more and more complex.
Wow. So much to think about. If you're studying for those UPSC exams, you've got a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
Historical context, competing theories, shifting strategies.
For sure.
What stands out to you as the most important takeaways? What questions are you left with as we look ahead? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.
Yeah, let us know.
And hey, if you're finding these deep dives helpful, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of, critical global issues.
Definitely.
Until next time,
Yeah.
keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.